we're ready to get started. I think everybody's online now, or a good number of us. So first of all, hi, I'm Khadija Fancy, and I'm a member of the Safeguarding Hub's advisory group and the Safeguarding Technical Lead for Mott MacDonald. And I'm really pleased to be chairing this webinar today. So before we get started, we thought we'd have a little think about why it is we're having this webinar today. In the midst of a global pandemic, we find ourselves at the nexus of the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movements. Here we find a long-needed reckoning on gender and racial justice and their intersections. And this reckoning demands an examination of power and privilege. For organizations that work in international development and social justice, these movements should drive deeper thinking about how the cultures and structures of our organizations contribute to inequality and to the silencing of staff and of the people we work with. So this reckoning, again, forces us to consider safeguarding. What is it and how do we achieve it? So in today's webinar, we're going to dig into that question. In the Hub's early review of the global evidence on the root causes of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the sector, the findings were stark, but not surprising. Power and privilege are unchallenged across the sector. This includes the continued dominance of a small northern-based group, mostly white and mostly male, in leadership, and continuing disparities of station and power between international and national staff. The organizational cultures of go along to get along, boys will be boys, are found across the sector and militate against diversity and protect rather than challenge power and privilege. This creates permissive environments for abuse of power, including SEAH. The warnings and calls for deeper work have been with us for as long as any of us will remember. More recently, Kachingwe, Sandvik, Cornish Spencer, and many others have warned us that what's needed for safeguarding is not so easy. It's much deeper change. So in this webinar, we're looking at how we go beyond compliance and towards transformative change, how we look at power and privilege within our organizations and how these affect our ability to achieve the safeguarding aims that we all have, and also go beyond our safeguarding aims to the changes that we want to see in the world. So today we're going to hear from three women who have been at the forefront of this work and who will, I am sure, challenge us and help us to explore not just what kind of safeguarding we want, but what is safeguarding and why we need it and how we can get there. So our first speaker is Sally Proudlove. Sally has been the head of safeguarding for UNICEF UK since 2016. She has over 20 years of experience in child protection and safeguarding and over 5 years working in the Global South. Since the safeguarding crisis in 2018, Sally has led work within the international development sector in the development of organizational and leadership tools for promoting a positive safeguarding culture within development organizations. Following Sally, we have EJ Wynn. A Zimbabwean citizen, EJ has been an active feminist in social justice movements in her country, in the African continent, and globally. EJ served as ActionAid's International Global Head of Women's Rights from 2004 to 2011, and since 2014, she's been ActionAid's International Director of Programs and Global Engagement. Together with other feminists in the sector, EJ contributed to the setting up of the Feminist Humanitarian Network, whose objective is to shift policies and practices of the humanitarian sector globally to uphold women's rights. Finally, but not least, we have Geeta Misra. Geeta is the co-founder and executive director of CREA in New Delhi. She's a feminist who's worked at the activist, grant-making, and policy levels on issues of sexuality, reproductive health, gender, human rights, and violence against women. Before joining CREA, she was a program officer at the Ford Foundation, where she supported non-governmental organizations in Asia working in the fields of sexual and reproductive health and rights, violence against women, and women's human rights. Geeta has served as co-chair, president, and advisor for multiple organizational boards, and presently she is a serving member of the Astria Foundation Board and Amnesty International Task Force on Gender and Diversity. With these illustrious speakers, we will be looking at, one, what are the criticisms of safeguarding and of the approaches that we take. We'll be mapping better ways forward, and we'll be identifying the support and tools and knowledge we need to invest in. So without any further ado, I turn over to Sally.
Okay, good. Hello, everybody. It's a privilege to be with you this morning, or whatever time of day it is for you, wherever you are. I'm going to be talking through some of the work that I've been involved in trying to develop some tools that organisations can use to really reflect on their safeguarding culture. So if I could have the next slide, please. I'm going to be thinking about, talking to you about the work that we've done and try and pull out some of the key things that we've learned. So moving on to the next slide. When we think back to the crisis, the safeguarding crisis as we refer to it now in 2018, lots and lots of issues came to light at that time. But one of the key things that we kept coming back to in the sector was that really many of the behaviours that were being described were not primarily issues around policy and procedure. And it wasn't for a lack of standards and due diligence. We've had safeguarding standards and levels of compliance and due diligence within our sector to differing degrees for many years. There are lots of safeguarding sets of standards that people can refer to. What was recognised was that really primarily these were issues and problems that were created through a culture that wasn't right. And that could be both within an organisation, within a specific team within an organisation, or actually potentially within the sector as a whole. And so what we needed to do was to think about how do we address those gaps and how do we think about what culture means. So next slide, please. I was part of a group of organisations that came together to say, we will look at this issue of culture and see what we can do, what we can contribute. So we recognise that we're just contributing a tiny part of the conversation, but we hope that some of the work we've done is useful and will provide some useful tools. So we brought together a working group. You can see there the different skills that were reflected in the group. And what we set out to do was to not replace standards and other resources that there are at the moment within our sector, and actually that we can learn from other sectors, but to build on those and to think, what's the actual gap here that we need to be addressing? We wanted to gather insights from people that are working on the front line and to really make sure that anything we produced was piloted well so that it was really genuinely useful. The really key thing that we understood we needed to do was to be able to articulate the difference between compliance and culture, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. We committed to creating tools, and in particular a tool for leadership, because we recognised that many of the problems that we were facing, and actually I've worked in different sectors in the area of safeguarding, and I would say this is a consistent characteristic where there are problems with safeguarding issues or how they're responded to, is that often leadership is at the right in the centre of that, and the extent to which leaders really own this issue. And so we've developed a number of tools, and one of those things is a series of slides. So the next slide, I'm just going to share with you really the journey. If we could have the next slide, great, thank you. What we started to do was to articulate this journey that organisations need to go on. And that, I realise there's a lot of text on this slide, but you'll have access to this presentation and you'll be able to read it a little bit more at your leisure. We wanted to help articulate the difference between non-compliance, minimal compliance, or even just compliance, and an effective safeguarding culture. And what we recognise through speaking to organisations is that when people talk about a safeguarding culture, actually what they're very often talking about is compliance. So for example, organisations would say, we've got a good safeguarding culture. Everybody in our organisation does safeguarding training. And we would say that's really great that everybody does safeguarding training, but that's not actually a statement about culture. Really, that's a statement about compliance. What we want to really ask ourselves is, what difference does it make in your organisation to the living, breathing experience, both being a worker in the organisation or a volunteer, but also somebody for whom the work of the organisation is intended to benefit? What is the experience that these people have of engaging with your organisation, and how is that training brought to life and lived and breathed in your organisation? So what we took into consideration, if we can have the next slide, please, we based our work around the core humanitarian standards. We didn't want to kind of reinvent the wheel. And we also thought about serious case reviews and consultations around this topic, not just within the international development sector actually, but also more broadly within child protection, in domestic cases too. And we also looked at serious case reviews, and there were a couple of things that really stood out for us in terms of what a healthy culture means. And just to say, we didn't go down the kind of academic route of trying to define culture. It's a really slippery topic, and it's a difficult thing to define. The best definition we actually came up with was by one of the people involved in the working group, Marcus Aruga, and he described it as the way we do things around here. And we felt that was really useful. It was just, what's the normal behaviour that we have in our organisations? So we felt that we wanted to look to build organisations where there was a really explicit safeguarding culture, and that values and behaviours were articulated and lived at each level. We wanted to be able to express what that meant in practice. And also a culture of curiosity, scrutiny, and constructive challenge at all levels within the organisation. How do we make ourselves open to this kind of challenge? So next slide, please. One of the key groups I mentioned already is around leaders. And so we committed to developing a leadership tool, which is what we've now got in draft form, and we're looking now to digitalise that so that it's more accessible to people. We felt that there was a really crucial role of senior leaders, and these were some of the things we identified. That the extent to which words and deeds match. We felt there was a compartmentalisation sometimes, where people were signing codes of conduct, we were signing up to policies and procedures, but actually then our actions and the way we behave, or the way leaders behave in organisations, doesn't actually match what we've signed up and what we've committed to. Really importantly, how do we as leaders deal with failure? How do we own that and acknowledge that? And also other people's failure within our organisation. How do we take responsibility and enable organisations to learn? Really important that our values are lived and acted out. Some other points there that you can read, but what we identified was that senior leaders and their behaviour was really key. So moving on to the next slide, we developed a tool, and we took various headings, again, based around the kind of headings in the core humanitarian standards. And we developed a set of cultural indicators. So this is just one example. There are many of these. But what we wanted to do was say, okay, this is what the, so somebody's saying that they're having trouble hearing me. I apologise for that, if that's the case for everybody. Basically, that we had a cultural indicator that people needed to then had the guiding questions around how we could encourage people to think about and challenge themselves in terms of whether or not they were working towards this cultural indicator, and then a series of suggested actions for how organisations can improve and leadership teams can improve. and move towards. And there's a whole series of these that we've developed to support leadership teams in addressing this issue. And one of the things that we really learned through this process was how important it is to build in external challenge. It doesn't help us in leadership if we all sit round together slapping ourselves on the back about how well we've done in terms of this topic. We need to be really challenged and called to account by external kind of robust challenge. So the next slide for us, please. Key questions we felt we needed to ask of our organisations when we're being challenged and when we're getting that external kind of robust questioning about how we're doing in this space. Who gets a seat at the table? Who is really involved in that challenge? Who's making sure that we are being held to account? Again, it's no good if we just have the same groups of people perpetuating the same culture. It's really hard to analyse your culture from within. We need to have that external challenge. Who has decision-making power in organisations? And we know that very often that can sit with a very small minority, and decisions can be made without any consultation or recourse. Getting organisations to really think about what behaviours indicate genuine shifts in power, and how does the organisation feel different when those shifts in power are made. How are we educating ourselves about the interplay between different power dynamics? And this webinar is really bringing that kind of intersectionality into the forefront. But how are we having conversations about the cultural interplay between issues of race, issues of gender, dynamics between adults and children, for example, dynamics between people who are seeking to kind of give and mediate aid and support, and those, if you like, who are receiving it. How do we own all of the power dynamics that go on in that space, and how are we articulating those? And really crucially, how do leaders demonstrate that safeguarding is going to stay a priority, particularly in a post-COVID or mid-COVID context, when organisations are struggling for resources? How do we make sure that this issue doesn't fall off the table? And just lastly, my final slide, to just talk through how we've used this. So the idea with the tool, it is just a tool. We don't think it's the kind of silver bullet that's going to address all the problems, but we do think it's useful, and we've piloted it with organisations, and they've felt that it's useful and that there's a place for this. Our suggestion will be that people use this in their leadership teams, and that this is done with some external challenge, and we've got some ideas about how that can be done. That we think very carefully about how different levels of staff and people within the communities we work are involved. We've got a series of slides, 6 slides, that really take people through that journey from compliance to culture. And we found that those have been really useful in organisations at all different levels. But what we want to do is to see these tools as starting a conversation. It isn't the be-all and end-all. But we do think it's a really important conversation to be had, and we want to think about how we can be made accountable in terms of the plans that we make. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Khadija.
Hi, thanks, Sally, and I will hand over to EJ.
Thanks, Khadija, and thanks very much, Sally. In a way, you kind of made what I want to talk about today a bit easier, because one of the issues that kept coming up in your slides was the whole question of power, and that's what I want to focus on today. Because for me, as a feminist, as someone coming from the women's movement, even though I have spent the greater part of the last 15 years in an INGO, I still consider myself, part of the greater women's movement, and that's where my experience comes from. So when Khadija asked me to be on this panel today, just to say, I really struggled, because I say to her, I'm not really quite engaged in the conversations about safeguarding, to the extent of, how somebody like Sally is. And so I come to this, as I said, from my background in the women's movement, from the work I've done on violence against women, but also I come to this in terms of my work as a programmer, because that's what my role involves, doing programming. And so what I'm offering today is a way in which I think we can advance the conversations, on safeguarding, by looking at some of the tools, by looking at some of the analysis that has been used in this movement, in the work that we've been doing, particularly using the power framework, which I think many of you are familiar with from the work of John Gaventa, but more today I'm using the adaptation of that has been used by an organization called Just Associates, who I'm sure many of you know, and I am privileged to be on the board of and have been a part of. And so, as I said, I'm going to focus on power, because I think it offers a way for us to look at, how the whole safeguarding agenda is coming into our organizations, how we are, we are advancing that, but also I want to say what are some of the shortcomings, right? If you look at it, from the perspective of power, and we know this in terms of our programming work that we normally do with communities, with rights holders. So please put up the slide. Thank you so much. So, as I said, I'm going to talk about, the whole concept of power, using the power framework that many of you have seen before. So I'm not that clever. I'm not the one who invented this. You know this from the work of many scholars and many activists. So, when we talk about power, right, it's important to remember that power is not static or monolithic, that power is relational, it's dynamic, it's in us as individuals and how we exercise that in different settings. It is held by both groups and by individuals. It is structural, it is institutional. It operates both in the public and the private arena. It's inside of us, as I said. Power can also be good, but it can also be bad, as we know. So many of us are also familiar with, the work of feminists, naming positive power, right? So where we talk about power to, power with, power within, and so that's kind of the positive side of power. But what I'm going to focus on now in terms of this conversation is sort of the negative side of power, right? Which we call power over. And I want to use this triangle that you have in front of you as a way for us to kind of slice through to ask ourselves the question, what are we seeing as we try and advance, the agenda on safeguarding? And Sally has kind of, talked to some of this, as I said earlier. So, this slide, this triangle is basically saying, if you look at negative power, you need to look at sort of, the three faces of it, right? So the first, which is on your left, which is, what we can call visible power, right? So it's the kind of power that you can touch, feel, see. You're talking about, policies, you're talking about the rules, you're talking about the people who are sitting at the decision-making level, the ones who make decisions. So whether it's the leaders, as Sally was, referring to earlier. So those are the people that we know in any organization, in any institution, are the people who are making rules, who are deciding, what's important, what's on the agenda, who gets what, how resources are, sliced up and shared, and what goes where. So I want to say, in terms of this, for me, from where I sit, I would say, from the little that I have seen, right? And I don't claim to be an expert on safeguarding, but I would say, I think we are doing very well as a sector in terms of the visible stuff, right? We have a lot of policies, many of us, my own organization, in the last sort of 2.5 years, we have seen a slew of policies, being enacted in our organizations, as we should, right? Because you need to set the norms, you need to set the standards so that you can hold people accountable, to those, and it's important for those to be written down. Just as much as, in our countries, in communities, we need to have laws and policies, that criminalize, for example, violence against women and girls, or violence against children. So those things are very important, right? Because those are the standards that you will see. And you need, of course, to have named individuals, whether those are the people who are going to be leading the agenda in the organization, the ones who are going to make decisions so that you know where to go, when you have a problem. So I would say we've done very well in terms of that piece. Yeah. But I think on the second side, which is on your right side, the hidden, or what we're calling shadow power, right? So here we're talking about, my friend Lisa Venner-Klassen likes to say, those who are under the table, right? So it's not often the people who are sitting at the decision-making table, the so-called leaders with the titles, but it's sometimes, and I would say quite often, it's those who are under the table, who are pulling the strings, who are determining how those wonderful policies that we might have, those laws that we might have in a country, how they will then get implemented, right? So these are not necessarily people with the decision-making power, but they have some level of power, and they have the influence on those who are sitting at the decision-making table. So, here, let me tell stories, which I like to tell. So from my work that I've done over the years on violence against women, one of the stories I like to tell is of how, when I worked in a women's organization, women would come to our offices asking for help, right? They have a problem, domestic violence, sexual violence, or, claiming child support, right? And you would then, show them where to go. This is the papers you need to fill in. But very often you would find women coming back and they said that I can't go in and that I should go home to sort out the problem. And you would say, they, who is the they? So it took me a long time. And eventually I discovered it wasn't even, the police, it wasn't the magistrate, it wasn't the decision maker, it was actually somebody standing at the gate who was the security guard from a security company, who is simply meant to be showing people where to go in the court system. In our organizations, another story I want to tell is, of trying to implement a women's rights program. You set up the trainings, you set up, the program itself, you've got all the best experts invited, and then suddenly you get there, the hotel hasn't been booked, or the food hasn't been ordered, and you're wondering, what is it that's happened? Only to find out that somebody in the finance department just simply sat on top of the check and decided not to make the order just because he doesn't like the women's rights agenda. So we need to be very mindful of that, and we need to look at that in terms of, where we are going with this agenda. I think the last side is of course what we call invisible power, right? Which is about, and I think Sally spoke to some of this, the culture, the norms, the beliefs, the attitudes that are held not only by, people impacted by laws or policies or what's going on, but even by the decision makers themselves and or the people who are under the table, right? And so the whole aspect of culture, and I think Sally talked to some of this, to say, what is it that people believe inside our own organizations about this particular agenda? What are the attitudes towards, women? What are the attitudes towards gender equality? What are their attitudes and beliefs towards, in terms of race, for example, which is, an emerging conversation in many of our organizations now, to say, are we having that conversation? What are people's beliefs about one another, north, south, black, white, across those different divides? And so very often you will find, You will have the wonderful policies, as I said, in place. You will have the trainings, you will have the awareness, but as long as people have particular beliefs, as long as people hold particular, values, you will find that, those often run aground. If we don't unearth and talk about that which is happening sort of in people's hearts and minds, which is, sometimes you can't touch it. In fact, oftentimes you cannot touch it, but you can feel it, you can see it. And so the culture of our own organizations, and I think, again, Sally talked about some of this earlier, right? What are those cultures of our organizations, the way we do things here, right? So it doesn't matter, again, what the piece of paper says or what the policy says. It is how things are done over here that then often determines whether there will be accountability for women's rights violations, whether there will be impunity, and whether, those norms and standards that we have set are actually being implemented, begins to set the culture, that we see. So that was just my offering that I wanted to put on the table, which I thought might help us, because we have used some of this a lot in the work that we do, with communities, with rights holders. And if we can apply some of this in our own organizations and see how far we can get. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, CJ. That was really great. The first challenge is on the table. The second challenge is on the table. Now we turn to Geeta. Geeta, over to you.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I hope people can hear me. And thanks to Sally and EJ, who said a lot of what I will allude to, and you already know how how we're thinking about power and what can organizations do vis-a-vis safeguarding. I think I want to begin with a statement which I often think about. Violence against women has finally achieved global attention, has become a global conversation at the national level, at the local level. Even though feminists and women's organizations have been thinking about safeguarding for decades, maybe it wasn't called safeguarding, and I wonder why now. The feminist movements have been talking about women's rights and human rights, and it leads me to think, is it because horrific things began to happen and got global attention through technology, through social media, through younger people who had different notions about shame, honor? So that's one statement. I think the other one, building on what EJ said, I want to go back to this idea of power, and maybe more like social power, and link it to the capacity of different individuals or groups who determine who gets what, who does what, who decides what, and who sets the agenda. And I think within institutions, organizations, societies, who has power can be determined by societal norms that provide privilege to a certain set of people and exclude a certain set of people for reasons around social norms or people's lives who are less valued. So I want to link power, privilege, exclusion, and social norms. Now, can we go to the first slide? I want to begin by saying that's where I think we are now. And I think a lot of us now want to talk about policies because we think they are important for mainstreaming practice, but they remain meaningless unless we want to do something about it. And I think they remain meaningless for people who are lower down in our societal hierarchies, which I just explained. So, for example, a person with a disability could be abused or be part of an organization, and there may be very good policies on paper, but if the culture, alluding to what Sally said, doesn't provide a kind of mindset where people with disabilities are seen as also being agents for their own change or having autonomy, it could result in people with disabilities feeling excluded, feeling like they have less power and less voice. So I think the culture of impunity, misconduct, exploitation, harm is all quite messy by and large. And it's riding on the backs of misogyny, race, class, patriarchy. And I think we are in a moment where we're trying to figure it out. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide, this slide and my last slide. I have a few more, because I feel like there's sometimes this confusion about what is the feminist project around SEAH or violence against women or sexual exploitation. And I want to say that even it's not simply saying that all women should be abused, or, should be believed, even though we know the staggering statistics about women that face violence are extreme and are the highest. And what I mean by that is we need a more kind of nuanced approach where we look at effeminate boys who are abused because they're seen as genderized as female, or emasculate men who are in conflict situations who are also raped, and because they've been genderized to be seen as more weak or masculine or more feminine, or intimate partner violence that exists within same-sex couples. And in that sense, I feel the Me Too movement did two things. It made us weep and it made us dance. It made us dance because there was finally a breaking of silence in a different way. I think silence has always been broken by many, many women's rights organizations that worked on safeguarding. But I think it made us weep because I think the nuances of the violence and how to address it became muddied. And we couldn't fit, at some point, the idea that consent is complicated and it couldn't be boxed in black and white. And therefore, I think the Me Too movement, was created sometimes a split on what interventions should be around the issue of violence. And if as a feminist, as part of the feminist movement, we believe that we need due diligence, we need to figure out, listening to both sides. We believe that perpetrators must also have rights, even though we know who mostly perpetrators have been. I think the feminist movement was often asked to take sides, and I think it was hard to step away from absolutes. And I think that has also been a kind of issue that we need to deal with in terms of negotiation of consent, because then it comes to bear on young people who could be in law be seen as minors, but are having consensual sex with their girlfriends, but in societies where adolescents don't have autonomy, agency, and choice, families could put away the boys around statutory rape. Now, I'm talking about all this because I think it influences how our organizations deal with some of these issues. Next slide, please. So I think EJ has covered this, so I'm not going to cover it, except to say that I just want to quote Srilata Batliwala, who also works with Kriya and has written a lot about power. And she talks about the concept of invisible power that EJ said, and it's the power to shape the way people think and feel about themselves, and the force that creates social attitudes, biases, and the way our desires and needs are influenced. So I think what organizations have done is try to build ambitious common goals, co-ownership of people, trying to get communication that is open and goes both ways. If you create a culture where you have not one person representing an organization, many people representing it, more faces, more co-ownership, maybe that in itself inculcates a feeling of voice and not a feeling of being oppressed and not being able to speak up. Can I move to the next slide, please? Yeah, I think we need to, we all say that we feel power needs to be shared within our spaces, within our organizations. We shouldn't have monoliths and hierarchies of oppression, but I do think people who are lower down in societies come into our organizations already feeling they have less power and then feel that they have less power within these settings to confront abuse, be able to say no, be able to go, because they haven't even thought about where to go, what to do. And I, for example, I could give examples of gender non-conforming people or lesbian women who begin working in organizations, or religious minorities who work in many of our organizations and come in already feeling like they have less power. And so what do we do to shift power and share it with the people that already feel less empowered when they come in? Next slide, please. I have 2 more slides. So I feel this is a big issue in terms of, how power feeds into relationships and structures. And it can't just be an exercise where the human rights teams or the legal teams, or you do the trainings and you feel like that is going to take care of the problem. How do we have more people representing, how do we have more people representing our organizations? How do we not allow some people to preside over power? Because otherwise we do create this idea that some people are experts and some people are not. Next slide, please. So this is what I just said. The next slide, please. So I do feel moving forward 3 points in terms of thinking about how we could impact the whole sector of safeguarding. One is, I think, moving from a protectionist approach to protecting rights. How do we protect women's rights versus protecting women? We would lead to different answers once we began to sift some of those things out. How do we build a culture where we respect all people and get rid of these ideas around respectability that are embedded in shame, honor, reputation, so that people are able to feel their own autonomy, their own agency? How do we build a language? How does the feminist movement work on a language on where, beyond just looking at issues of harm, violence, and suffering, but what does well-being, what do positive rights mean for people who have suffered abuse? And the last would be, what could be small practices in organizations that we could share with each other, that we can learn from each other, so that we begin to implement the theory. So in a way, theorize the practice, but also practice the theory. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Those have been incredible presentations, all 3 of you. And I think at this moment we turn on our videos and start a conversation. That includes me. There we go. So I really, really appreciate the inputs, and I really think that the conversation is really rich, and I can see lots and lots of questions flowing in. So I'm not sure we will get to all of the questions. Apologies, but we hope that this is the beginning of a conversation and that we will get to them in the course of our time together today and other times together. So one of the first questions that came in that I think it would be interesting for all 3 of you to think about is on the question of gender mainstreaming. we did that in the 80s and 90s, and there were a lot of failures and learning coming from that. What do you think are the learning from gender mainstreaming and its failures for now integrating safeguarding into organizations? To what extent can tools get us to where we need to go? And then this other piece is a critical part of that as well. There's a conversation there that we missed when we were doing gender mainstreaming. Maybe we can build on it today. I wonder if we can start with, well, this question will start with Sally and go in order, and then the next question will go in a different order.
Okay, I think I would just reflect that anything that becomes a policy requirement, you know, anything where we make, for me, it falls back into this conversation about the difference between compliance and culture, about whether we're really kind of winning hearts and minds, or whether we're enforcing something that has to happen. And I think what I've found with safeguarding is what I've described it as a kind of a carrot and a stick. I'm not against compliance, I'm not against policy requirement, I'm not against policy. What I'm saying through the work we're involved in is it's not enough. It doesn't end there. And if those policies aren't developed with the right people at the table and with the right level of self-reflection, both as individuals, I take, you know, personal responsibility for that, and as organisations, then we don't really progress the conversation and progress the lived experience of our organisations, both as people within and for whom we're trying to benefit. So I think kind of policy requirement and an expectation that certain things are done and met and are good, I don't think they're bad, as long as they're the right things and the right people are part of those, but they're not enough. That doesn't necessarily tell us that we've got a healthy culture. It might, but it might not. I hope that answered the question.
Absolutely. I don't know, EJ, Geeta, do either of you want to come in? EJ, do you want to come in next?
I think just to say, one of the things that I have noticed, particularly in the development circles, in the INGO circles, let me put it that way, we tend to then do an overkill, right? With pieces of paper. We can make our lives a little bit simpler. Honestly, if I look at the humanitarian subsector of the sector, it's the number of policies and CHS standards, and I don't know whichever one. God, I can't keep up. I mean, thank God there are other people who remember them. So I think if there's only one thing for me to say is, let's not overdo it, guys, right? Let's make things simpler, because it's not the amount of paper that we generate. It's using those pieces of paper. And sometimes maybe let's just experiment, innovate, and then create the papers afterwards. How about that?
Radical thinking. Geeta?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of confusion that gender meant women and not that power didn't figure. So it became a set of checklists, and you could go through gender trainings and you felt you had mainstream gender. And my very favorite example is a whole bunch of judges in India who went through gender training, but thinking that gender was being now mainstreamed in many, many different sectors. But if you look at the judgments that the judges made, not a single one was gendered in terms of, you know, in favor of women or against the perpetrators of violence. So it became a very superficial, formal exercise in many places. And we felt we were combating issues and shifting power, when all we were doing was kind of creating a formal way of thinking that people were addressing gender.
So in a way, what I'm hearing from the three of you, and I think it really resonates with that learning from early gender mainstreaming, is that gender mainstreaming in the early days, in fact, it didn't challenge the power dynamics, it followed the power dynamics and tried to layer a set of tick boxes or tools on top of an existing power dynamic in order to say, now you also have to look at, as opposed to look at all of this differently. That's a very fundamental challenge that exists. Our second question goes to a even deeper challenge on this, is says it's not just intersections of race and gender, but also looking at colonial dynamics and how the aid sector sits within things like the white savior narrative. This is a huge challenge for us, and it is particularly a challenge when you're looking at power dynamics, if you're not examining power dynamics and privilege, but also if you're looking at a mechanistic response with tools. It will always favor those who sit in the north and sit with a certain type of education, a certain type of mentality, because we're slightly better at tick boxes, I think, and that privileges us. So I'm wondering if one of you wanted to respond to that. Maybe this time we'll start with whoever, with EJ. Did you want to start with that?
One of the inbuilt problems with the development industry is that it was created to deal with problems over there, right? It wasn't meant to be about us and how we sit in that space and behave in that space. I think that's one of the things that we need to acknowledge, right? So poverty is over there, gender inequality is over there. It's those people, right? And so that's why we are uncomfortable, even now, having a conversation about race. We are struggling, right? Because it's like, were we supposed to talk about ourselves? Right? If we were meant to be, wasn't it about those people that we're supposed to help? And when you try and start the conversation, and I've had that personal experience, it's like, why are you taking up the organization's time? This is not the important conversation. We are here to resolve the problems over there, right? And that's a challenge because now we are being called upon to look at ourselves, the roles that we are playing, our own power and privilege, and how we show up in the space, right? And we are being called upon to shift the way we interact with over there, right? And how over there interacts with us. And so that's the place where we are now. And we are struggling and we are looking for ways to have those conversations. But fortunately the conversation has started. So let's get on with it, but there shall be lots of tears, as they already are. And we need to be prepared for it. And we need to, accept that reality that we haven't been honest. And so time has to do that.
Geeta?
I mean, I think EJ said it, so I'll just say one thing. And I think it's about, especially vis-a-vis the colonial encounter, is also about power and voice. And I think in that sense, the Me Too movement and technology has allowed to, even though academically and practically the whole idea of the subaltern, who, the subaltern speaks, has always been there. But I do think that now the spaces within which we can have a voice and confront the whole colonial encounter, which in each country would be slightly different. I think we, as EJ says, we've moved the conversation to even acknowledge that these things are connected. That colonialism wasn't just about national borders, and aid is about development and protecting and feeling good about your charity. I think all of this has gotten much more connected through also some of the work that's been going on recently.
Sally, did you want to come in on that?
I would obviously echo everything that's been said. I think there's something about us taking personal responsibility for what we get out of being in this sector, particularly, I think, if we are white and from the global north. I think there's something about personally reflecting and taking responsibility for the narrative that we are part of perpetuating. So I think that's quite a challenging thing to say. I think I would say something about power. One of the things I've reflected on in this is how difficult it is for people to relinquish power. Power is not like love. I can have lots of children and love them all the same. But with power, if other people are going to have a bit of my power, I can't keep all of the power that I've got. You know, we've got to actually understand what it means to relinquish power in the conversation. And I think we struggle with that a bit. I think we struggle with that a lot. And so I would challenge us to think about that. The other point I would just make is we were talking about the tool and the danger with it becoming just another kind of global north-led. The tool is not what's important. What's important is the conversation. So the tool's only useful if it helps us have the right conversation. We do not want this to become another compliance process that you have to do to get funding. It's only useful if it helps you talk about the difference between compliance and culture.
I think that's so important, because clearly when we develop tools, we all develop them to support a process, support a conversation. It's when they get lost and become the process in and of itself that they lose their power. Sorry, wrong use of the power, but if you understand. I think we only have time for one last question, and I think so apologies to all the great questions that have come in. I wish we could stick around and do them all, but I think this one is an interesting one. It seems to me that safeguarding culture is a journey that begins with awareness on safeguarding, developing standards, compliance, and finally safeguarding culture. That's the order in which the questioner has put it. What would it take for an organization to undertake this journey, to achieve this? How long would it take? I wonder, Geeta, whether you wanted to start on that one.
Khadija, your voice...
Was I breaking up?
Yeah,
okay.
So I didn't hear the first part. Can you just quickly...
So the question is, it seems to me that safeguarding is a journey that begins with awareness on safeguarding, developing standards and policy, compliance, and safeguarding culture. What would it take for an organization to achieve this, and how long would it take?
Yeah. I think that it's I don't think it's a step-by-step process, you know, where you first have awareness, then you have practice, then you'll assess whether the scale is enough and whether the organization has arrived. So to me, I feel it's in your dailiness of it. It's every day, and it's about how every organization and person within it practices a way of expanding space, expanding voice, expanding the culture that they are also complicit in building. And it, you know, to give you an example, I mean, you could be in an organization that I had found called Sakhi. We didn't name founders. It's never been named. Anybody who built the organization over the first 5 years were founders then. And so how do you build a co-ownership where the whole idea of safeguarding is safeguarding each other and not just safeguarding against the man, against the boss, against, you know, someone who may seem like the other. And, you know, if we had time, I would tell you some amazing stories within the organization that we've had when the whole Me Too conversation broke out. It's about representation, so that it's not one person that represents an organization. It's flattened. So there's ways in which you practice every day a little bit of giving up of power at every level. Thank you.
Excellent. Sally, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. I think that genuine culture change does take time. Having said that, I have worked with organisations where the attitude to safeguarding has changed almost overnight because there has been a change in leadership. And I think individuals can be very powerful, either for good or bad, in organisations. And I think one of the things I hear a lot about this conversation is that it's complex. And I think parts of it are complex. I noticed there was a question about doing this in emergency settings. You know, that is complex, but we can't use the complexity argument as an excuse for the bits that are not complex. You know, adult men sexually exploiting women in the community. That's not a complex problem. That there might be complexity there, but where they've signed up to codes of conduct, where there's clear guidance, where they know how they should behave. Let's not use the complexity argument as a kind of an excuse for why we can't address that. I think we have to get the balance right in terms of how we talk about it. So I think culture change does take time for it to be genuine and authentic. I also think it can happen very quickly if we really commit to it and decide we're going to do this differently, and we're going to be hard on ourselves and ask ourselves difficult questions. But we've got to be prepared to go through that process, I think, in order to do that.
EJ, do you want to round us up on this one?
I don't know if you can zoom in on me so that people can see my little graphic.
You have to hold it up a little bit. I can't. I don't know if I can see it quite right.
So change is a little bit more like that, right? It's a lot messy. It's not a straight path, as Geeta said, and Sally agreed. And we know this from our work on women's rights in the world, right? We know this from our work on racism in the world. And so the same applies here. I think that is the only thing I wanted to add, but I think it's also Sally has said, we got to start somewhere. Every little bit helps, and every little bit connects with, every little bit. And so let's learn the lessons from our programming and bring them in here, and have that attitude that, every little step builds towards, a bigger sea change.
I have to thank the three of you for a really, really rich conversation and deep engagement with these issues. I wish I could beautifully summarize it with a couple of sentences, but I think that that's been done a number of times in the course of this conversation. There's a lot for us to work with going on here, and a lot for us to continue to talk about. I see safeguarding as sort of the thin edge of the wedge. There is a moment now. There is a moment where Me Too is meeting with Black Lives Matter, with this pandemic globally. There is a moment where change is happening. And if safeguarding and putting it in this space helps your organization to tackle these deep issues of power and make change happen, great. And we should make that happen. We should support that in every way we can. So I hope the conversation continues, and I want to thank the three of you so much. There's a short poll that's popping up hopefully on your computers. It shouldn't take more than a minute to go through, so please take a minute on that one, and then I have some quick rounding up points on next steps. But thank you all so much. Thanks for the participation, thanks for all the questions, and thanks to our panelists.